The Green Gown. Her Name Was Not Ophelia. Final version by Megan Clare Pierce. Her eyes, turned so frankly and yet somehow shyly toward the painter, were brown, very nearly black. Her hands were delicately folded in her lap. Her mouth was closed, unsmiling, though the curve of her lips was strange, mysterious, as if she knew something that nobody else in the world knew. Of course Mr. Lytton, the gentleman taking her portrait, rather liked that about her. He was rather fond of the way her thick, sandy hair wisped about her face like a halo. Well, no, it wasn't exactly à la mode, as the ladies of quality loved to hoot as they clustered together in their fluttering gaggles, but it was just loose enough to remind him of the way she'd looked in his bed the night before, and just modest enough to pay lip service to her supposed innocence. The young lady stared back at the painter, blinked, and continued staring. Were she any younger, she might have coyly bitten her lip, and blushed at the older man's discreet leer. As it was, she was only a year out of the schoolroom, and already she felt dead behind the eyes. Beneath the sumptuous green gown she wore, her stays were tightly laced, her bruised ribs pressing into her lungs, suffocating her from the inside. Outside she was stifled by courtesies and formalities. "How do you do, my lord, and isn't this a dreadful bore, don't you think? Why, last week all that could be talked of at the Featheringtons' rout were the latest designs to have come out of Paris, and how ghastly it was that Miss Evelyn Healy had a cousin who was involved in trade. How awful for a man to have to work for a living, truly. The gentlemen were worse if it could be thought possible. Sir Fitzwilliam Smythe would not leave off the story of how he'd been honoured with a knighthood for his services on the Dark Continent. It had taken every ounce of his courage to face down a horde of spear-wielding savages sat on a gelding, armed with the finest blade British money could buy, don't you know?" No, she didn't know, but that had been neither here nor there as far as the honoured gentleman was concerned. Her input was not at all required in that particular conversation, nor had it been required last night with Mr. Lytton. Her input was never required. She looked across at her mamma, sat in the corner of the parlour, with her little bit of embroidery, her shawl swathed about her arms, hiding the bruises that papa inflicted when he'd indulged in a little too much port at his club. This happened often. When she was much, much younger, she had never understood why her mamma's milky skin would be coloured purple. That was until papa had come in late one night while she'd been looking for a book in the library, and dragged her by her hair, swearing vile oaths while she screamed. She'd been 8 years old when she'd finally grown up. The next morning she'd put her dolls in boxes, buried her dreams of marrying a handsome duke who thought of her fondly, and asked Mrs. Smith, the housekeeper, to see her moved out of the nursery. Mrs. Smith's tired grey eyes had crinkled sadly as she eyed the girl-child's raw scalp and swollen red cheeks. She'd sat her on a chair and solemnly told her to stay in the nursery as long as possible, out of her father's way. She'd taken Mrs. Smith's words to heart. She'd stayed in the nursery. She'd stayed out of the way and not made a sound. Glancing at Norton as he entered with the tea that mamma had ordered for herself, her daughter, and Mr. Lytton, she reflected that she was there still. After all, was not lady simply another word for chattel? A possession to be sold to some gentleman, kindly or otherwise. It didn't matter, because either way, chattel sounded remarkably like cattle. While she thought this, she pretended to be intrigued by gossip, scandal, and drapery, all the things that distracted the ladies of quality from the heinously elegant truth. Mr. Lytton's thin lips curved as he noted to mamma, with a flourish of his paint-brush, that the green gown complemented the youthful bloom of her daughter's skin quite enchantingly. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes, not at him, but at herself. Why precisely had she engaged in an illicit liaison with this odious fellow again? She couldn't exactly recommend the awkward fumbling and heaving. Yes. She wanted to experience as much as she could before she took her leave of this world. Well, it certainly held nothing for her. No one would miss her. Well, mamma and Mrs. Smith might. Papa would be glad that he would no longer be obliged to provide a dowry. When she was 14, she'd read Hamlet and promptly decided that she would like to have been called Ophelia. Such a pretty name for such a tragically romantic figure. Was not Shakespeare a master at his craft? The beautiful lady had drowned herself for want of love, and she would surely do the same, because surely she could not bear to live a life without love any longer. She couldn't help but smile wryly at the thought, prompting Mr. Lytton to request that she keep her features quite still. Right at that moment, in truth, she was glad not to have been called Ophelia. It simply wouldn't have fit. Her name was Eleanor, and she was tired of the world. Meanwhile Mr. Lytton kept on painting, while her mamma adjusted her shawl and poured her tea.